The role of the rifleman has been a pivotal one throughout the long course of our military experience. Despite fantastic increases in military technology, the individual soldier is more important than ever before. The rifleman remains the very heart of an unbelievably complex warfighting system which safeguards our very way of life. For those who choose to be on the cutting edge, the risk has always been significant. Now, more than ever, the worldwide spread of nuclear, biological, and chemical agents demands that we must be ready to fight successfully on a contaminated battlefield. The potential for the enemy use of biological and chemical agents against coalition forces during Operation Desert Storm was real. It demonstrated that possession of these agents and the capability to use them in combat against us is an increasing threat to our military combat operations. Our best guarantee for survivability and success on future battlefields is in constant training and rehearsing combat missions in an NBC environment. We will discuss lessons learned from these tests, which apply to light forces fighters. However, these lessons learned are important to all soldiers. The Combined Arms in a Nuclear Chemical Environment, CANE tests, were a series of field evaluations to support what every soldier who has ever operated in MOP knows, that the effects of NBC contamination on mission completion are significant, but that they can be overcome. The degree to which light infantry combat operations were actually affected may even surprise some of you who long ago recognized the challenges of operating in MOP gear. Light infantry companies were tested, as well as 81mm mortar platoons, fist teams, 105mm towed artillery batteries, light engineer squads, smoke decontamination platoons, and medical sections. Mission requirements were grueling, but realistic. The scenario required each company team to conduct one-day defense and 3-night attacks in each of the trials. The threat drove the MOP level. However, soldiers wore MOP 3 or 4 during all movements to contact, attacks, and in the defense. Battle command, fire support, intelligence, and combat service support functions were closely evaluated. Additionally, and as importantly, human factors such as dehydration, fatigue, stress, and leadership challenges were identified. Before we talk about specific test findings, there was one common factor throughout the test. Most functions took longer to perform in a chemical environment. Not only a little longer, but as much as over 100% longer, as in the task of breaching wire obstacles at night in MOP 4. Let's take a look at some more specifics. The ability of light forces to maneuver in a chemical environment was greatly affected. Light forces moved at about 1/2 the normal rate, thus taking twice as long to reach the objective. Movement techniques were degraded by almost 1/4. Soldiers were not as effective in avoiding skylining, using natural concealment in bounding, in positioning key weapons, or in taking appropriate action at danger areas. Movement control techniques that were adversely affected included movement in the designated formation, on specified routes, and in both light and noise discipline. Reconnaissance became increasingly important, but was accomplished at a slower rate. Units took easier routes, used roads and trails, and took more tactical risks by using closer formations and moving slowly. Friendly units were engaged at greater ranges, yet we could acquire targets at only half the range of a clean battlefield. Not only was the range at which we were engaging the enemy significantly decreased, but we fired 40% fewer rounds, which resulted in 65% fewer enemy casualties. 1 soldier in 4 never fired his weapon in the assault. The fewer rounds fired, plus the increase in rounds needed for a hit, resulted in almost 75% fewer enemy soldiers being engaged. Units were not as survivable in the chemical environment. Both the friendly forces and the enemy were seriously affected while operating in protective gear. Fatigue, however, played a more significant role on the attacker because of prior time spent maneuvering. Movement from the line of departure to the objective was more physically demanding than defending. There was a 9% decrease in the ability to maintain directional orientation for all elements of the combined arms force. This degradation increased to 17% for dismounted units. As the mission progressed, leaders micromanaged more and delegated less. Units had a hard time locating other friendly forces, as well as orienting on the objective. Over the course of the mission, leaders became exhausted and critical tasks suffered. Tactical discipline, camouflage, and OPSEC measures were generally not enforced, and unit cohesiveness suffered. Troops began to worry more about their individual survival than the unit's mission accomplishment. Soldiers also became careless with their equipment. On the objective, consolidation and reorganization became slower and more difficult to accomplish. In after-action reviews, leaders and soldiers said they were not sure they could repulse a counterattack. More time was allocated both in mission analysis and restatement, developing courses of action and making tentative plans. However, as the missions progressed, leaders discarded detailed plans and used plans which were simpler to execute. Synchronization of the plans was degraded by 23%, fire support coordination by 9%, and plan rehearsal by 9%. Leader recognition was difficult. While units depended more on radio communications were less effective. Duplicate radio transmissions increased by 23%.
Roger, say again.
Decreased peripheral vision made hand and arm signals less effective. Manual dexterity was considerably reduced, especially the ability to maintain individual and crew-served weapons. The ability to use individual weapons was also degraded. Night operations were more difficult. Where the light fighter once ruled the night, the incompatibility of night vision goggles with the protective mask was overcome only by using the goggles like a telescope. Getting steel on target became challenging for both mortars and artillery. Transmission time for calls for fire and the time to lay the guns increased. Less rounds were fired, and less accurate fire was the result. While the fist acquired 1/3 more targets, the accuracy of calls for fire was decreased by 1/3. It took 50% more time to transmit calls for fire, and gunners made twice the normal number of errors. These errors were twice again as large. Fire missions also took 20% longer. Camouflage took longer. There was consistently more movement and clutter and trash in the area, which increased vulnerability to enemy air attack. Intelligence operations collected less information. Combat service support functions saw the slower delivery of supplies and movement along the main supply route. Drivers lacked confidence in their ability to drive while in MOP 4. The medical system was slower to respond, with slower casualty evacuations. Now that the specific effects of operations in an NBC environment are known, we may now focus our efforts on solutions. Fortunately, one solution lies within the area of our greatest strength: how we train. Experience has demonstrated that we will fight precisely as we train. Units in combat suffer when elements of combat operations have been ignored or performed poorly in peacetime training. While we are effective in conducting conventional operations, the Kane tests have shown that we must improve training for combat operations in a contaminated environment. Technology will doubtlessly provide us less limiting equipment, but in the interim, we cannot sit idly by and wait for technology to catch up. Will it be easy or comfortable? No. The road to efficient combat operations in a nuclear chemical environment is a steep one. The Kane Close Combat Light tests indicated that while combat operations were significantly degraded in a chemical environment, soldiers can learn to operate effectively in this limiting environment in the first few days of a war or now during training. Performance in the contaminated environment improved considerably over time. These results were typical of many measurements. Soldiers learned to operate in MOP 4 after only 96 hours of intensive experience in a contaminated environment. Training to perform missions under NBC conditions has a rapid payback in unit effectiveness. While this training will not be easy or comfortable, we have the soldiers to make it happen. We always have.